Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving straight into Pastor John Bevere's incredibly detailed breakdown of end times prophecy. Look, if you've ever found the topic of eschatology a little confusing, maybe intimidating, or honestly just plain exhausting, you are definitely not alone. But today, we're going to visually unpack the exact timelines, the historical traditions, and the really profound psychological impacts of anticipating the return of Christ, all sourced directly from Bevere's research. Let's get right into it.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to hit 5 key areas. First, the trap of apathy. Second, the actual timelines of the end. Third, why it's a marriage and not just an event. Fourth, the history of the Essenes and Simeon. And finally, what it actually means to eagerly wait for Christ.
All right, kicking things off with part 1, the trap of apathy, and why studying the end times often backfires. Let's look at why so many people, including Bevere himself for over 4 decades by the way, have historically just avoided this topic altogether.
You know, this source material points out a really stark contrast in human behavior based purely on how this topic is handled. Focusing strictly on setting exact dates traditionally creates some, well, pretty toxic behaviors. People get lazy. Some have famously stopped paying their credit cards or literally sold their houses because they were absolutely convinced the end was happening on a random Tuesday. But Bevere argues that when it's approached correctly, the focus doesn't produce apathy at all. Instead, it generates this extreme urgency, a real passion for soul winning and complete life transformation.
Get this. After dedicating thousands of hours to studying this back in 2021, Bevere stumbled onto a wild statistic. 1 out of every 30 verses in the New Testament is about the second coming. Let that sink in. It was the second most written about subject by the early church fathers, right behind salvation. Seeing that kind of overwhelming biblical emphasis is actually what forced him to finally reconsider his lifelong avoidance of the subject. Moving right along to Section 2, Timelines of the End. Let's look at the biblical math behind the urgency and see how Bevere builds his specific calculations. Now, to be clear, he emphasizes that he is not setting absolute dates here or claiming to know the exact day or hour. He's arguing that these are markers for awareness.
Okay, so let's walk through the math. The first set of calculations stems from the book of Hosea, which prophesies that God would revive Israel after 2 days. Bevere takes a biblical principle found in Peter, that a day to the Lord is like 1,000 years, and does the math. Jesus was crucified roughly in 32 or 33 AD. Shortly after that, between 70 and 132 AD, Israel was scattered. If you add 2 days, meaning 2,000 years to that time frame, it lands humanity roughly in the 2070 to 2075 window.
But then he overlays a second, completely separate timeline. He examines Jesus' words that the generation seeing these signs will not pass away. Now, Israel became a nation in 1948, sure, but Jerusalem actually came back under Jewish leadership in 1967. According to biblical dictionaries, generations in Scripture are 40, 70, or a maximum of 100 years. So if you take that 100-year absolute maximum generational window and add it to 1967, it points right to 2067. And wow, that creates a really compelling tight overlap with his previous 2070 calculation.
So, what are we supposed to do with this math? Well, Bevere uses this awesome 5K race metaphor to make his point. Think about it. If you know you're entering the final stretch, you don't just pack up and quit, right? You don't sit down on the track. You run the fastest during the last 100 meters because you can finally see the finish line. He argues these timelines aren't an excuse to check out. They are meant to produce a final sprint of energy in our lives right now.
Which brings us nicely to Section 3, a marriage, not an event. This sense of urgent preparation makes a lot more sense when we look at an ancient cultural metaphor.
The source material completely reframes the end times from a scary, cataclysmic doomsday into a highly anticipated wedding. Back in the day, an ancient Jewish wedding went like this. After the betrothal, the groom would leave the bride and go back to his father's house to literally build an addition to their home. This construction could easily take a year or more. The kicker? The exact day of the wedding wasn't circled on a calendar. It was dictated solely by the father's approval of the construction. The groom couldn't go back until his dad said, "Okay, it's time." This left the bride in a constant, active state of preparation, just excitedly waiting for her groom to show up at any moment.
All right, part 4, the Essenes and Simeon. Let's look at the historical precedents for studying these signs, because you might be wondering, if it's supposed to be somewhat ambiguous, why even study the timelines at all?
To justify this, Bevere points back to the first coming of Christ. 1 Corinthians notes that the prophecies about the first coming were kept intentionally vague.
They were a mystery by design. Why? To confuse demonic principalities. The idea is that if the rulers of the age had understood the exact details on the grand plan, they literally never would have crucified Jesus. But here's the fascinating part. While the why was a closely guarded mystery, not everyone in ancient Israel missed the when.
We see this really powerful historical contrast. On one side, you've got the Pharisees. These religious elites perfectly memorized the first 5 books of the Bible, yet they completely failed to recognize the Messiah, even when he was a 30-year-old man performing miracles and raising the dead right in front of their faces. On the flip side, you have the Essenes. This was a super ascetic sect living out in the desert, the folks who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because they intensely studied Old Testament prophetic timelines, like the ones in Daniel, they actually predicted the exact timing of the Messiah's arrival, down to the week of his execution, over 150 years before he was even born.
Bavaire highlights one specific man from this era named Simeon. Now, biblical scholars are pretty convinced Simeon was an Essene. Keep in mind, the temple in Jerusalem wasn't a quiet little chapel. It was a sprawling, chaotic, mall-like complex absolutely packed with crowds. Yet Simeon makes a beeline straight through all that chaos and instantly recognizes the Messiah as a mere 40-day-old baby. How? He could do it simply because he had studied the timelines and knew exactly what window of history he was living in.
Finally, Section 5. Eagerly waiting for Christ. Let's look at the psychological shift from apathy to anticipation. This is the exact posture that Simeon modeled, and it's what Bavaire argues believers should actively adopt today.
It all hinges on this one incredibly important Greek word, prodekomai. When the scriptures say Simeon was eagerly waiting for the Messiah, this is the word they use. It doesn't mean you just think about an idea every once in a while. It means remaining in a continuous, active state of eager expectation. It's actually the exact same word and the exact same posture that Jesus later commands of his followers in Luke 12, when he tells them to stay dressed for service and eagerly wait for their master.
Bavaire says that adopting this prodekomai mindset totally flipped his own life upside down, in the best way possible. Far from making him want to sell his house and quit his job, it did the exact opposite. His wife actually started calling him her favorite husband because he essentially became a 2.0 version of himself. He was less intense, way less prone to anger, he found himself with a deep burden for lost souls, and he resolved to work 10 times harder in his everyday earthly callings. Anticipating heavenly things didn't make him useless, it vastly improved his earthly responsibilities.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I'll leave you with this pivotal question to chew on. Does your view of the future actually change how you live today? If you truly believe you are running the final sprint of the race, does your understanding of the end of the story fundamentally alter how intentionally, how passionately, and how enthusiastically you live your life right now?